in our religious arena. So in religious education, we're going to cover the introduction today. Today is the first section. We'll go over the syllabus and religious education, what that entails in our understanding of how religious education is taught in today's culture. This is our winter quarter, and the course is called BED 208 Religious Education. I'm going to briefly go over some of the materials for this course, the syllabus, and what we're going to go over this course. This is again a required course for Bachelor of Religious Education, and also as part of the Bachelor of Theology program. If you can look in your syllabus, I have 3 required readings and 2 recommended readings. These are going to be important to our discussion of this course. The first required reading is by Ronald T. Habermas, Introduction to Christian Education and Formation, subheading, A Lifelong Plan for Christ-Centered Restoration. This book will mainly focus on the Christian education, not any other religion, but Christian education and formation. So this will be a lifelong address on how to teach religiously, how to receive that education religiously, and we want that to be a Christ-centered approach and formation. So this is a restoration. This is a book on restoring the Christ-centered approach and perspective, and this will be the required reading for our course. Davis Derek and Elena Mirosnikova. This is the second required reading. This is a journal on compilation of different essays, different articles on religious education all across the world. This will include countries like Australia, United Kingdom, US, Korea, Japan, all these countries, Indonesia, Malaysia. These countries will be included for Islamic education and different religious education all across the European Union, all across Asia, and this will include the East and the West. So I'm going to divide, as you see, as I explain to you the outline today, what we're going to go through this course, throughout this course. I'm going to tell you that in this section, the courses of religious education or focus of religious education in the East, meaning the Orient, and the West, or the Occident. So these two education, paradigms will be compared with one another, from the Eastern paradigm to the Western paradigm. In the Oriental education, I'm going to include countries such as China, Korea, Japan, and other countries that have their religious education. I'm going to talk a little bit about the religious education philosophies as well, and how Eastern education, I'm going to get into it, but this handbook, the Routledge International Handbook of Religious Education, this will be a journal. So if you have a database access to any other school, library, or platform, you can always access this. You can also look it up on Google Books. I think you can rent or buy this textbook. And this will be very important in our discussion, again, talking about the Orient and the Western. understanding of education and their philosophy and how they bring that about in different various countries. Also, my third required reading is the Freddie Cardoza, Christian Education, A Guide to the Foundations of Ministry. This is a book published in 2019. Freddie Cardoza writes about this guide, practical guide. So again, 3 required readings: Introduction to Christian Education, Christocentric approach. That's what I'm gonna main point of my lecture on this course. And the second is a more of an in-depth look in religious education throughout the world, so you can see that in a broad perspective, and come back to the Christian foundation. And I have that as the kind of a practical guide that Freddie Cardoza writes to the foundation of ministry. And some recommended readings I want to briefly highlight is a handbook. Again, this is another Rutledge handbook. James Arthur and Terence Lobat, the Rutledge International Handbook of Education, Religion, and Values. This will be a very important book. It is not required, it's recommended, but this will be a guide of how, I guess it will be an accompaniment to the required textbook of the International Handbook of Religious Education. So this will be a handbook of education, religion, and values. So more focused on education and religion and values will back up this book's claims. And then I have another book. If you look at the syllabus, the second recommended reading is by Daisy Christodoulou, and this book is The 7 Myths About Education, a book written in 2014. This will talk to us about some of the myths of education and how that really impacts our learning leading up to religious education. And I'm gonna, before I talk about the course outline, I've always started with a brief note on how we think about education. And again, as we dive into this topic of religious education, before we get into it, we need to know what is education. So I would have loved if we were together on this, and I would let you guys discuss on some of the questions. Sometimes having the right question first is really important. So for instance, before you begin a journey, you count the cost. Especially in the Bible, even Jesus says, before a builder builds a tower, this builder counts the cost, plans accordingly, and looks at the liability, looks at the assets, and he makes a discernment on how much it will cost him. Same way, if you build a house or if you build anything, you would count the cost. And that's what he was saying about, if you want to be a disciple, if you want to follow the Lord, you have to count the cost. There is a cost to following Jesus Christ. In the same way that applies to our course as well. Before we begin, we need to count the cost. We need to count the cost and how we will be changed. Education is very important because once you learn something, it's very difficult to unlearn. Let me say that again. Once you have learned something, it's very difficult to unlearn. There's very different ways of how we learn. And I'm going to cover this in our lecture as well. There's different ways this has been a study on especially education, psychology, and I guess philosophy, and this relates to our discussion of religious education, because there are mainly 3 ways of learning. There's kinetic learning, where you move um, where you move your body, and that's how you learn information. That's how you process information. And there's didactic learning, there's teaching, lecture and learning. And there's also, when you write, you can learn faster as well, read and write. So there's different types of learning. Before we do that, let me talk a little bit. I would have you discuss amongst yourself if you were in class. But what are some of the questions that we want to begin our course with? What are your expectations of learning with this course? I mentioned about counting the cost. So what do you think will be the cost of learning? And I mentioned just briefly just now that when you learn something, it's very difficult to unlearn that and learn something new once that has been cemented. So what is education? That's a very important question to ask. What is education? How are we going to define education? And how are we going to talk about this, not just the education part, what about the religious part? What does it mean by religious or religions? And again, the question then comes down to what is religious education? Briefly, quite simply, we can divide the types of education to formal, informal, and non-formal. So I'm gonna quickly define education. So what is education? Education is a gradual process in which this educational process brings positive changes in human life and behavior. We can define education as something that brings about a positive outcome to our behavior, to our life, to our understanding, to our mind, to our thoughts, to our philosophy, to our understanding. We can also define education as a process of acquiring knowledge. In the Proverbs, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of all knowledge. So education is a process of acquiring knowledge through studying or imparting the knowledge by way of instructions or some other practical procedure. Acquiring knowledge through study, or imparting knowledge by way of instruction or some other practical procedure. That's why the common medium of education has been reading. That's why universities always have libraries, sometimes 24/7 libraries. A library is where you can read and you can acquire knowledge by reading that book, that text. And as you know, the Bible is a written book, and that's what we learn as Christian. Again, this is going to be a Christ-centered religious education course. And our primary textbook of that religious education is the Bible. We have the required readings today, as I shared, 3 required readings, 2 recommended readings. Our primary textbook of religious education, Christian religious education, is the Bible. And the Bible has been written in a way revolutionizing even in the Old Testament, because mainly the history, the story, the way of preserving history at that time was mainly orally. Oral tradition was was the standard medium of that day. Now, throughout history, it has changed. So again, 10 Commandments was written in stone, carved in the stone, and then it was into scrolls, papyrus scrolls. And in Jesus' time, there was a scroll. Egyptians beat out the reeds of the papyrus reed, and then they made scrolls out of it. Some of the scrolls that we find are on leather and ink, on some animal skin that's written by after the late Middle Ages, after the Crusades, and around that time, they started trading with the East, and that's when paper was traded, and that's when they started getting the printing press and Gutenberg Bibles, and so on and so forth. And after that, after the Reformation, that paper was widely circulated, and the printing press printed all the Bibles. And the Bible was preserved, and that religious textbook was preserved in a technology that has not been seen in the world. So this educational process of acquiring knowledge through study or imparting the knowledge by way of instruction is the medium in which we attain practical knowledge, practical education. So what is education? Education brings a natural and lasting change in an individual's reasoning and ability to achieve targeted goal. Education facilitates us to investigate our own considerations and thoughts and make it ready to express it in our own various shapes. That in itself is we attain knowledge, and we gain this ability to achieve our goal. Our reasoning expands, our thoughts expand, our philosophies expand with this, and then we can digest that and have that to be ready in ourselves to express in various shapes within us and outside of us. So education is something that encourages us to distinguish between right and wrong. So this is moral education argument, because in the absence of education, we can't do what we need to do or not to achieve our goal. So this saying, it teaches you about morals, right and wrong. So we can say education is a safe passage to progress. It's progression of thought. It's the extension of our existence as a knowledgeable being, reasoning being. We need to tackle the types of education, because education is fundamentally learning of abilities and ideas that can make us increasingly innovative and increasingly a good problem solver. There are three types of main education. Three main types of education. First is formal education. This includes the school. This includes this hierarchical. It has hierarchical structure where a teacher and a principal and teacher and the students. In this formal education, there's institutions. There's high school, junior high, college, university. It's a uniform system. It's full-time. So when you're a student, you're a full-time student. Subjects are oriented. There's certification and degrees that you receive once you complete this part of the education. Practical learning is not in this. It's more of a system. Informal education. So this happens with maybe a tutor. It includes practical adult learning. This teaches you something different from the schools. Diversity in methods and content. It mobilizes local resources. It builds on the learner's participation. When you tutor someone, when you respond, you get something back. So this mentorship, tutor, understanding of informal education is very important. Real life examples of learning are readily given in this education. The third and final form of education, type of education, is non-formal education. This takes a long process, very long process. You learn from experience, you learn from the home, you learn from your environment, you learn from your parents, you learn from your work, you learn from different people, your friends. So this is non-formal education. It takes a very long time to learn. So these are the three types of education. Again, if we just briefly summarize, first is formal education. Usually takes place in the premise of the school where a person learns basic academic or trade skills. So if you want academic traits, you go to a formal education. Small children attend nursery, kindergarten, but formal education begins elementary school, continues to secondary school. Post-secondary education or higher education is usually at a college or university which grants an academic degree, right? It is associated with a different specific stage and provided under a certain set of rules and regulations. The formal education is given by specifically qualified teachers, professors. Me, I have a degree from a seminary which allows me to teach. I have a master's in divinity and I'm working on my DMin. I'm completing my paper, my dissertation. So this gives me a stage in which I can, with my formal education, I can teach. Formal education given by specifically qualified teachers, they are supposed to be efficient in the art of instruction. So as a teacher, I have a responsibility to teach with ability, teach with a certain degree of professionalism so that it won't be a burden to you, burden to me. I have a responsibility to teach in a way that's engaging. I need to be efficient in this art of teaching. This also observes a strict discipline. The student and the teacher, they're both aware of the facts. They engage themselves in the process of education. Examples of formal education include the following: learning in a classroom, aka this classroom, school, grading, certification, college, university degrees. So when you graduate from Lordland University, you get a piece of paper, you get a degree, good job. We joke by saying we spend thousands of dollars for a piece of paper. I spent tens of thousands of dollars in 3 pieces of paper, bachelor's, master's, and doctorate. Is that just, that very expensive piece of paper? Actually, it gives you a certification. So, entrepreneurs, people who are hiring you, they look at the degree as a certification. You get this as a certification. It shows you that you a worker, you are potentially someone who can work within the system of the company. That's why they look for college degrees. That's why they look for higher education degrees, because it shows you within a system, you work within a system for this amount of years. Again, that is rapidly changing with the fourth industrial revolution and so on and so forth. But still, degrees they are a good indicator that you will succeed in this company. Most of us are not entrepreneurially minded. Most of us we receive education through an institution, and we receive a degree from that institution, and that gives a certification for this place in this formal education setting. Characteristics, I'm going to share some characteristics of formal education. Formal education is structured hierarchically. There is a hierarchy in this formal education. It's planned, it's deliberate, it's scheduled fees, they are paid regularly, so you pay tuition. It has a chronological grading system, so you see a grade over the years. Syllabus and subject oriented. So in the beginning, I shared with you the syllabus, kind of a agreement between the instructor and the person who is learning. I'm going to share some disadvantages and advantages. First, the disadvantages of this form of education. Sometimes students are bored because it just is boring and it's very hard to just sit in one place. And one of the other disadvantages, there is a chance of bad habits that can fester over time. So if you're not having a good attitude, these bad habits can fester. Wastage of time. So you waste time, as some lazy students may fail to learn properly in spite of motivation by the professional trainers. So some professional and non-standard education system may cause the wastage of time and money of the students, which leads to disappointment for formal education, argue them to go to non-formal education. Costly rigid education, this doesn't really help. The cost is high. Some of the advantages of a educational model, organized education model, is this gives you a organization, gives you a model, it gives you up-to-date course contents. Another advantage is students can acquire knowledge from trained professional teachers. Another advantage is also this strategic, systematic learning process will be helpful to you in your learning. Intermediate and final assessments are ensured. Institution managerially, physically, they're organized. You will receive a certificate. You have a formal certificate. It's easy access to jobs. So jobs will look, again, I just said that. I just mentioned jobs will look for your degree. Again, moving on to informal education. So we talked about formal education where you're in it right now. Informal education could be a parent teaching a child how to prepare a meal, or a parent teaching a child how to ride a bicycle. This is informal education. People can get informal education by reading many books from the library, or these days you can do informal education from Google. You can Google anything. We're living in an era unprecedented, never seen before. On the tip of your hand and a touch of your finger and your ability to just expand with your two fingers, the tip of your finger, you can just touch it, right? Knowledge is within your grasp, but there's so much out there that you don't even know what's right. That's what's happening today. There is so much out there that sometimes you don't know what to look for. For example, there's so many streaming movie platforms now. So Netflix, Disney Plus, Hulu, HBO Max. There's so much out there. So sometimes it takes hours for you just to decide what you want to watch. I can confess that I've done that before. I'm scrolling through these platforms. I want to watch a movie, but I can't really decide on what because there's so much content out there. In the same way, a informal education, you have the information that you need in the tip of your hand with your smart device, phone, laptop, iPad, anything. But you don't know what to look for. That has become the kind of digital, paradox or enigma. Informal education is when you are not studying in a school and do not use any particular learning method. You don't utilize any method. In this type of education, conscious efforts are not involved. It's neither pre-planned or deliberate. It may be learned at some marketplace, hotel, at home. So it's not, you don't come to a classroom, you don't come to school, you don't attend any lectures, you don't attend any classes, you don't follow a syllabus, you don't follow any system. This is very informal. It may be learned at any place. So advantages, I guess, you can go to anywhere and learn it. Unlike formal education, informal education is not imparted by an institution or a university, school, or college. Informal education is not given according to any fixed timetable. It could be a long time, it could be a short time. There's no set curriculum required. There is no system. It's not systematized. Informal education consists of experiences and actually living in the family and community. You don't have to live in the school. You don't have to be in the school. You can just live in the community and learn informal education. Some of the examples of informal education include teaching the child in your family some basics such as numeric characters, alphabets, numbers. Someone learning his or her mother tongue, mother language. This spontaneous type of learning, again, if a person standing in a bank learns about opening and maintaining an account from a bank from someone, this is informal education. Some of the characteristics include it's independent of boundary and walls. It has no definite syllabus. It is not pre-planned and has no timetable. No fees. You're not required to pay any tuition. You can just learn not by paying a tuition. You can learn by daily experience and learning something new in this. This process is a lifelong process in a natural way, so you can learn this naturally. This certificate degree is not involved, and one has no stress of learning new things. You don't have to learn new. You can, learn the same thing over and over again. You can get any source, such as media, internet, life experience, friends, family. I'm going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages. Advantage of informal education is that it's the most naturally learning process you can get. Anytime during your daily experience, you can get this. Involves activities like individual and personal research topics, utilizes books, libraries, social media, internet, or gaining assistance from informal trainers. Utilizes a variety of techniques but no methods. That's the, advantages. Can be disadvantages too. No specific time span. You can spend your whole life in informal education. You can spend a little bit of your life in informal education. So I guess you're constantly learning when you engage in this type of learning. It's less costly, time-efficient learning process. Because you don't need to hire anyone. You don't need the help of a profession. You can be self-learned. You can measure your process of knowledge with students, public, through social media and the internet. So learners can pick up the required information from books, TV, radio, conversation, internet, family members, etc., etc. Some of the disadvantages of informal education, they include information acquired from the internet, social media, TV, radio, conversation with friends and family lead to disinformation. Big problem right now. There's so much content out there. Guess what? Your family, friends, they're experiencing the exact same thing. Let me say that again. I remember I said right now, on the tip of your hand, you have all the information you need. But I told you that there's so much content out there. In your lifetime, you will not be able to read every single thing. Let me guarantee that. There's so much out there and it's just increasing at an exponential rate that by the end of your life, you will not have read everything there is to read. I guarantee that. You cannot be able to learn everything that you need to learn in this one life period, in your 70, 80, 100 years of your life span. So I guess really what you want to learn is focused on how you have this method concept. So this disadvantage of informal education, you don't know what to look for. And guess what? When you try to learn from other people, they don't know what to look for either, because the same thing's happening to them. That's kind of the paradox of learning. Technology, that's why I forget this technology term, paradox term, but there's this paradox of this era where we have so much technological advance, that we're living in a historically uncharted area where we've never been this smart before. We've never been this technological advanced before in our history of human life, right? But there is a regression happening. Meaning, let me explain it, because with every technology that has been an advance of knowledge, with every technology, with every technological innovation and advance in knowledge always follows. So for instance, when they started learning how to make bronze tools out of from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age or Iron Age, people I guess increased in their knowledge. When polio vaccine was invented, they got rid of polio. They understood better about polio. When we have vaccines, we understand more about that disease, right? When we have the printing press, we no longer, that medium of writing in papyrus scrolls and sheepskin, that was outdated, that we have understood more, right? Knowledge, increase of knowledge happened. We progressed, we didn't regress. But what's happening, again, so with every technological advance, there has always been a progression of thought, progression of wisdom, knowledge, they increased, right? With the introduction of universities, the learning increased, everything progressed. But what's happening right now, we have the most technologically advanced society, but guess what, we're regressing. We're regressing because technology is doing our jobs. Learning, that's why it's so important, because so for instance, before, when we didn't have smartphones, when we didn't have GPS on our phones, right? When we had, I guess, landlines and really expensive cell phones that really didn't do much, we didn't have any GPS navigation abilities where you have Google Maps. We had maps, physical road maps. If you see really like films in the 90s or shows in the 90s, 80s and 90s, they didn't have any Google Maps or navigation system. They had maps. They had to look at, either they had to memorize the roads, memorize where to go, direction, or have a really like foldable map and look at it to navigate where you're going in the highways. But now, because we have this handy dandy device, GPS, none of us know where. So when your battery runs out, when you don't have a charger, you really don't know where to go. You don't know. You can't get from A to B without your smartphone. We have become. It's interesting. This is the first time in our history when we're actually regressing. When we're becoming dumber, I think, because of technology. Technology has always advanced human thought, human progression of knowledge, but now it's interesting. That's the kind of the paradox right now. This lack of confidence in the learner and unpredictable results, information acquired from internet, social media, may lead to disinformation. This has been the disadvantages of informal education. Also leads to lack of confidence, absence of discipline, and attitude, good habits of learning. Finally, a non-formal education. The third type of education is non-formal. It includes basic education, adult literacy education, or school equivalency preparation. In non-formal education, someone who is not in school can learn literacy, other basic skills or job skills, home education, individualized instruction such as programming, program learning, distance learning, and computer-assisted instruction and other possibilities. Non-formal education is imparted consciously and deliberately and systematically implemented. It should be organized for a homogeneous group. Non-formal education should be programmed to serve the needs of the identified group. This will necessitate flexibility in the design of the curriculum and the scheme of evaluation. Some of non-formal education examples include Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts. They develop some sports program as swimming comes under, such as swimming comes under non-formal education. Fitness programs that are non-formal education. Community-based adult education courses, non-formal education. Free courses for adult education. Free yoga classes, non-formal education. This is interesting. Some of the characteristics of non-formal education is it's planned. It takes part apart from the school system. So non-formal, it's not formal. It's not informal, but it's non-formal. Timetable syllabus can be adjustable. Unlike theoretical formal education, it's practical. It's vocational, right? Sometimes if you're in class, aka this classroom, that's why I try to, sometimes if you're in this class, it's very hard to get to the practical. So that is why when I lecture in my courses, I don't know if you have checked out some of my previous courses. If you go to Lordland's YouTube channel, Lordland University's YouTube channel, you can look at all my previous courses that I've taught. But what I always try to do in this course is to have a practical approach. So I always introduce, spend a couple of lectures in my body to set up my argument, and I climax in my pinnacle, in my middle lecture, fifth or sixth lecture, I come to a climax of my point, my main thesis of my course in lecturing this course. And what I do is look at practical example, books after books, and I end with how to apply this in the context of ministry, in the context of, if you're not in ministry, in the context of your life. That is why even in this formal education setting, I want to be practical in my approach. But again, non-formal education, it's not like this theoretically formal education, but it has practical vocational education. Non-formal education has no age limit. These certificates may or may not be necessary. It may be full-time, part-time learning, and one can learn together. It involves learning or professional skills. So non-formal education is very, very important. I'm going to share advantages and disadvantages of non-formal education. Advantages of non-formal education include the following. Advantages are that it's a practical and vocational training, naturally growing minds that do not wait for the system to amend. There are some advantages with this. Literacy with skillfulness growth, which self-learning is appreciated. Flexibility in age, and you can do this any age. Flexibility in curriculum, you can be flexible as however much you want in this non-formal education. Flexible in time, there's no time constraint. Open-ended educational system in which both the public and the private sector are involved in the process. No need to conduct regular exams in this course. No diploma nor certificate, not essential. non-essential. Some of the disadvantages of non-formal education is that attendance of participants is unsteady. Sometimes it's just wastage of time. There is no need to conduct the exam on a regular basis, and no degree. A diploma is awarded at the end of the training session. Basic reading, writing skills are crucial to learn. No professional trained teachers, disadvantage. Students may not enjoy the full confidence as the regular students enjoy. Some institutions provide fake certification through online courses just for the sake of earning. So those are some of the disadvantages of non-formal learning. So again, education is both the act of teaching knowledge to others and the act of receiving knowledge from someone else. So it's a transference of knowledge between the instructor and someone else, between one or two people. Education, receiving through school and through a system of mentoring, of three systems that we talked about: formal, non-formal, informal. But education is basically a transferring of knowledge back and forth. Again, there's 4 levels: early childhood, elementary, middle school, secondary school, and then post-secondary or tertiary education. This education is very crucial in early years. So that is education in a nutshell. That's what I have for education. We're living in an interesting time where, because of this pandemic context that we live in, education has to be through a medium, such as media that we're using right now, where you see a recording device that records what this transfer. So again, what I'm trying to say is this transference of knowledge has to be through a medium. I can't directly talk to you, but it is very accessible anywhere now. Anywhere there's an internet connection, anywhere that you can access this, you can. And we're living in an interesting time where this knowledge of transfer, this speed of knowledge transference has increased exponentially. We're living in that time. I mentioned earlier about types of learning. And there's four main types of learning style. And this is how a individual learns this education, this way of learning. We all experience education in different ways. Education is instructing is the same, but the way we receive it is all different. It's a mix of some of these two. Sometimes it's a concoction of some of these two. Understanding these different types of learning styles can drastically impact the way educators, instructors handle their students. They set up projects, individual learning without understanding, then it can lead to a lot of stumbling blocks and failures. Teachers might end up with a handful of students lagging behind because part of their unique learning style hasn't been activated. So part of my responsibility as an educator is to really know what kind of learning styles students have and bring that out. So these closer look at these 4 learning styles. First learning style is visual. The reason why I have a PowerPoint is because most of us are visual learners. And because most of us are glued to our smartphone, I'm guilty of it too. It's very visual. It catches the attentions of your eye. Visual learners, someone with this preference for visual learning is partial to seeing and observing things. So visual learners, they see, observe, including pictures, diagrams, even when written directions and more. So they have this is visual learning style is also called a spatial learning style. Students who learn through sight understand information way better when it's presented in a visual way. So that is why students sometimes doodle, because they learn visually. Visual medium, in fact, is one of the oldest, before there was ever a written text to written system, alphabet, or Greek, Roman language that can be written down. There's cave paintings of Aborigines, oldest people alive. They would not have any written language, so they would draw pictures, and they would see and learn visually, and the knowledge was passed on with picture and story. So how to cater to visual learners? We need to use a whiteboard, we need to use a screen, smartboard, or something that you can see visually. So give students opportunity to draw pictures, diagrams on the board, or ask students to doodle examples based on the topic they're learning. Teachers catering to visual learners should regularly make handouts, use presentation. Visual learners may also need time to process material as they observe the visual cues before them. So they need this visual assistance in their learning. How to recognize auditory learners in your class? There is auditory learners. Second way of learning is auditory learners. These auditory learners, they learn better when the subject matter is reinforced by sound. These students would much rather listen to a lecture than read written notes. They often use their own voices to reinforce new concepts and ideas. These types of learners prefer reading out loud to themselves. They aren't afraid to speak up in class, great at verbally expressing things. Additionally, they may be slower at reading and may often repeat things teachers tell them. So in order to cater to these auditory learners, when you hear, people who hear, since these students generally find it hard to stay quiet for long periods of time, get your auditory learners involved in the lecture by asking them to repeat new concepts back to you. Ask questions, let them answer. Invoke group discussions so your auditory verbal processors can properly take in and understand information. So auditory learners, they have to speak it out loud, and they hear it and they understand. That is why this is another ancient form of passing down knowledge. They had stories, songs. Visual learners had pictures. Auditory learners had stories. Stories became myths. Myths became legends. Legends became the way that they, pass down knowledge. Watching videos using music audio tapes are also helpful for the auditory learners. Third type of learners, kinesthetic learners. How to recognize kinesthetic learners? They can't stop moving, right? They can't stop fidgeting. Kinesthetic learners, sometimes called tactile learners, or they need to move. They need to move their physically. They need to move their bodies to learn. Learn through experience of doing things. They like to get involved by acting out the events or using their hands to touch the handle or to understand concepts. These type of learners might struggle to sit. They struggle to sit still, often excel at sports or like to dance. They may need more frequent breaks to study. how to cater to them. The best way to cater is by getting them moving. Instruct the students to act out a certain scene from a book or lesson you're teaching. Also try to encourage these students by incorporating movement into lessons, pacing them to help memorize. Learning games that would involve moving around the classroom, having students write on a whiteboard as a part of activity. Once kinesthetic learners can physically sense what they're studying, abstract ideas, difficult concepts become easier to understand. There are learners like this, that they cannot sit still, they need to move in order to know, in order to understand abstract concepts. So that is one, this is another method of communication. Many of the societies that did not have a huge oral tradition, or that did not have a written tradition, they had dances. They had these dances that would pass down, especially in islands, Samoa, Hawaii, even Indonesia. Some cultures like that, they had dances that told a story to pass down knowledge, information of their ancestors. One of the oldest ways, three of the oldest ways of passing down story and knowledge: reading, writing, learners. This is basically where learners, this overlaps with visual learning, and there's some overlap with visual learning. These types of learners are drawn to expression through writing, reading articles or books. So to cater to these people, to these learners, this is probably the easiest way to cater, since much of the traditional education system tends to cater or center to cater to these people, cater to these learners, center on writing essays, doing good research, reading books. Be mindful about allowing plenty of time for these students to absorb information through the written word, and give them opportunities to get their ideas on paper as well. So as an instructor, I need to embrace all these types of learning. I need to know how these different learning styles, they don't end in the classroom. I want to equip you guys, not just here, but I want to equip you guys in all these four types of learning. So again, quick review, three types of education: formal, informal, non-formal, and four types of learning: visual, auditory, and kinesthetic, and reading, writing. So three types of education and four types of learning. All these 7 things will help the instructor and the student to somehow meet together in achieving this transferring of knowledge that I talked about. Especially in a day and age where we live in a paradox of an overwhelming plethora of abundant knowledge in the tip of our hands, and yet we can't get them. Just like I sometimes think of Midas. We're living in a Midas generation where everything we touch will turn to gold, because it's like that. Knowledge is gold. That's why we come to university, right? To learn knowledge, to gain knowledge. We're living in a day and age, it's a Midas generation. Everything you touch will turn to gold. And yet, because everything touches turn to gold, you can't really, there's so much treasure out there, you can't really handle it. You're overwhelming it. So it's making you more stupid. It's actually detrimental to us. So now it is our responsibility to filter out some of the things we need and don't need. That is so important in this day and age, where we need to first know what we want, what we need, before we search up just anything else. So again, this is a good argument. Some might argue, very good argument. Some might argue, wait, why am I paying money for so much of the same thing that I'm going to get over the internet? There's so many great lecturers out there. Why am I paying money to come to a school? That's a great argument. That's a valid argument. That's why people are leaving universities. People are leaving college. But I believe, especially this day and age, because there's so much out there, and you don't know what to look for. You need professional guidance. You need professional guidance on what to look for in this day and age. There's so much out there. You don't know what to look for. And you probably might you're already probably lost. So there is guidance that need to happen with a professional who know what they're looking for, who can clearly really sharpen what you want to look for, what you need. Here you go. This guidance and mentorship is key. It's a jungle out there, but living in a jungle, you get to experience things firsthand that you've never experienced before. I'm going to now go over some of the things that we're going to talk about this quarter. And before we do that, this course policies, I'm going to briefly go over that before we begin. Attendance, preparation, participation is mandatory. That will be part of the evaluation. Students are responsible for reading, understanding materials specified in the syllabus. Students are to come prepared, having reading the material for the week prior to class. Students are required to participate in all class discussions. Those are the policies, and read over them in your own time for now. Religious education, as you see on the screen. What we covered today is education part. Now we go to the religious education part. What is religious education? What are some of the ideas we see in religious education? And as I spent some time briefly in talking about this, it's incredible to see in this religious education. I want to focus on excuse me, not just an overview, but a definition, which I covered a little bit. And I'm going to try to combine the three monotheistic faiths, cover that, and come to a Christian conclusion. And I'm going to see if, I'm going to see how that definition applies to us. So, an overview of religious education, how religious education helps people to build a strong foundation religiously in our faith. All these faiths have this kind of their own system of education throughout the centuries, throughout thousands of years. It's faith forming. Religious education is ultimately their faith forming activity. They form on faith. Religious education can include different forms as well. We're going to discuss that. We're going to define them. We're going to look at different types of religious education throughout the years. First, monotheistic faith. We're going to look at main monotheistic faith. There are many religious education abroad and everywhere in the world, but I want to focus on three monotheistic faiths in our first discussions. So second week, we're going to cover Jewish education. We're going to start off with Jewish education. Jewish education, I wrote in my outline that Jewish education is the study of the aspects that preserve Hebrew language, Jewish identity, and engagement and continuity. Right? So this slide tells you how the aspects of Jewish education preserves Hebrew language. Jewish education, it preserves Jewish identity, engagement, and continuity. It preserves these things. That's why Jewish education is by far known throughout the world, and we see this in the Bible. Only the best, brightest went to Torah school. Actually, everyone went to Torah school. Everyone goes to Torah school. From a certain age, they teach the Torah, right? When they're good enough, best of the best, they go to Bar Mitzvah, or what we know today is Bar Mitzvah, son of the promise, son of the covenant. And after Bar Mitzvah, when the best of the best gets to go on, they follow the rabbi, only the best of the best, right? And there is a selection process. They continue to learn. And this is passed on to father to son, to the families. They preserve Hebrew language because it's a written scroll text Bible, right? Torah. Jewish identity, engagement, and continuity is preserved in this educational context. The study is a study of the tenets, principles, Torah, Talmudic education of the Jewish people. So education and gender, I'm going to approach that. Why it's always the father to the son. And how that is related to Jewish education. I'm going to briefly touch on that. As you see, wherever they are across the world, they still have this Jewish identity because they go to a Jewish school. This Jewish education is known throughout the world. As you look at the picture on the right corner, what they do is they have this huge scroll, right? And they go to synagogue, they'll learn, and they would have a metal with a golden tip. They would have this finger pointer that has like a finger like this in the tip of the metal thing they're holding, and they will follow the verse, every letter of the Hebrew alphabet. They will go and learn. Actually, it's right to left, right, in Hebrew text, and that's how they would learn in Bible Torah school. Jewish education, it preserves Jewish identity, engagement, and continuity. That's why Jewish education is so important. Second of the monotheistic faith is the Islamic education. Islam is a monotheistic faith that came after Judaism, came after Christianity. And they believe in Islam, that Prophet Muhammad, around when he was 40 years old, went to a cave. Angel Gabriel came to him, and what he did, he had no control. He was in a trance, and what he heard, he just wrote down like a robot. That's what he wrote down. And a lot of people in Islam, they believe that because because it wasn't from his own understanding, without his own personality, it's from God, it's from Allah, And because Gabriel was Allah's messenger, that's why because Gabriel came, and the messenger angel came and told, it was an angelic revelation, revealed message from God. Islam believes that is the holy text, Quran as the holy text. In comparison to the Bible, they were inspired by the Holy Spirit. Yes, Prophet Daniel was visited by angels, messenger angels, where it says the angel came, but the angel was held up by the Prince of Persia. So the war angel Michael came and basically opened the way for the angel to deliver the message to Daniel. So there are angelic visitations in the Bible, messages in the Bible, and Bible authors receiving that. But Bible authors were different professionals. Sometimes they were fishermen. Sometimes they were physicians. Sometimes they were kings. Sometimes they were prophets. Sometimes they were ordinary men. Sometimes they were tax collectors even, right? Matthew was a tax collector, wrote the Gospel of Matthew. That's why, because one person just heard something in the cave, claimed to be from Gabriel, wrote something down called the Quran, versus via Holy Spirit inspiration through many authors, were writing the same thing, same story, one message of the Bible. And we believe the Bible is telling a single message of redemption, of how to be saved, God's plan for redemption. It's all somehow connected through thousands of years. That's why the Bible is the greatest book ever written. It's the bestseller, hands down, of all time, because it starts from the beginning and it ends in the end of our human history. It is a story of redemption. Anyway, Islamic education is third week we're going to talk about Islamic education. Islamic education is a study of the aspects of the Arabic language and the Quran. Quran is a book, holy book, Islamic holy book, written in Arabic. The study of the tafsir and the fiqh and the madras. These are the educational aspects of Islam. Pre-modern and modern Islamic education, and education and gender, and how there is a lack of education for females in Islamic countries. There is, especially in areas like Afghanistan, there is a women can't learn in that part of the area. Only men receive that education. So that's what I'll be tackling in Islamic education. The third monotheistic faith is Christianity. In this Christian education, on my fourth week, I'll be discussing some of the Christian education and the philosophy. Faith, seeking understanding, integration of faith and learning. Faith, seeking understanding from St. Augustine and Aslan. As you grow in faith, you seek to understand. As you grow in faith, it is almost natural that you want to know more about this faith. So this integration of faith and learning and knowledge is very key to our Christian education. Both and approach compared to the either or versus neither nor. Very important. Christianity always both and. And when we receive it as yes and amen. Faith and reason, a need for radical integration rather than dualistic approach. rather than having some kind of this and get rid of this only and then this, A only and then we don't really need B. But I want to look at these two perspectives and then hopefully come to a understanding. So these three monotheistic faiths come from Abraham. All these three faiths come to a origin similar, or same origin of Abraham. And that is how amazing how God promised Abraham that he will be father to many nations, will be father to many faiths, will be father to multitudes through Isaac. Right? Through Isaac, the promised child, not Ishmael. That was Islam. Right? But nonetheless, Abraham, they claim Abraham as their father as well, father of faith. So we believe that there are three monotheistic faiths, and one is Judaism, and then Muslim, Islam, Christianity. These three faiths will have the longest educational system that flourished within the history. Islam being the latest religion, and yet what's interesting about Islam is that they have a specific educational system, more sophisticated than I guess Christianity or even Judaism. Judaism is all about preserving the laws of Moses, preserving the promise that God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Mosaic covenant, so on and so forth. It's focused on restoration of Israel, focused on God's covenant faithfulness to God's covenant. What Islamic education brought was Arabic numbers, technology and medicine, because they were the people who linked the east to the west. They were basically in the right middle of the Silk Road, that Ottoman Empire, right? That was an empire that was that reigned for hundreds of years. They were in charge of the Silk Road trade. So they were very wealthy because they conducted trade between the East and the West. Kind of a side note is because there was so much opposition. It was so hard to trade to India and Asia through land, because there was a Islamic presence there that did not really help. They monopolized trade. So what they did was they wanted to find another trade route that didn't go around Africa, that didn't involve going through the Islamic Empire that was blocking. They wanted to find another way. That's how Christopher Columbus found the New World, found the Americas, and then he thought he was in India. So that's why American natives are called Indians. Anyway, that's how amazing and amazingly sophisticated Islamic education was. And Islamic education, they had Islamic advances in science and learning. Medically speaking, they had more knowledge. So very important in that arena. Religious education, I want to talk about a Christocentric approach. Religious education shows us what Christ teaches us about education, Jesus, apostles, and education. And what happened was that what happened was when the religious leaders who received a lifetime of education, look at Paul, he was on the road to becoming a ruler of the Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin were like the 70 elders that ruled the Jewish council at that time, Jewish political arena. They were respected. They were the teacher of teachers. Nicodemus was the teacher of teachers, right? Religious education was something that was frowned upon. Was the pinnacle of pride at that time. Only the best of the best of the best survived Torah school, survived higher learning in Jewish context. What happened was everyone learned the Torah, and then if they're not the best of the best, they went with their father's trade. Patronage and serfdom and guild, that's what kind of the society was. If you're not cut in, if you didn't have the wealth, if you didn't have the right family background, you were a fisherman. If you were a tanner, you were Simon the tanner, your son is basically the Simon's son, Simon the tanner. If you are a fisherman, if you're son of Zebedee, right? Like John, son Bar Zebedee, which Bar is son. John, son of Zebedee, you're a fisherman because Zebedee was a fisherman. If you're John, if you're a James, if you're Peter, son of the fisherman, if you're Andrew, son of the fisherman, you are a fisherman. So that is why when Jesus said, "Follow me," which is what the rabbis of that day did to the disciples that they thought had potential in becoming the leaders and rulers, Sanhedrin, right? Sanhedrin were the teacher of teachers. If you're a member of Sanhedrin, you're a teacher of teachers. You would collect teachers of your own group, form a political party around you, right? So when Jesus said, "Follow me," and sometimes we don't know what that context was, but when you understand, wait a minute, they're living in this society where, if they're fishermen, they're always going to be fishermen, but if someone who had that kind of rabbi title, someone thought that I was good enough, of course I would lay down everything and follow him. Of course, if I'm good enough, I've been waiting my whole life for that follow me moment where this teacher thinks I have what it takes to follow in his footsteps. That's religious education at that time. But I want to talk about religious education in a Christocentric perspective. Look at what Christ teaches us about education and apostles' educations. And I want to apply that to ordinary people like us. Then in my 6th week, we come to our Lordland education, that handbook that talks about the East. Again, Eastern mindset and the Western mindset. Very different. But I'm going to somehow capture that. So religious education in Asia, we can talk about that. Religious education in Indonesia, the case for Islamic education. I'm going to talk about religious education in Malaysia and Israel. I included that in the East. Religious education in modern Russia, religious education in China, Japan, and Korea, the Far East. And this will include all the Eastern understanding of religion, Eastern understanding and the philosophies and traditions and practices. And that's what I'm going to focus on in that section. Religious education, and then again talking about the East and the West. So East, I'm going to talk about those countries according to that handbook. Religious education in the West. religious education in the European Union. Then I'm going to talk about religious education in the United States, United Kingdom. Then religious education in the United States. The history, philosophy of it, and then education, religious education. Western education is very important in that because English is the common tongue all around the world, that the education in the United Kingdom has been the central, must be the central discussion point. The 8th week, then, after talking about the East and the West, I talked about the global perspective, right? Now I'm going to come back to the Christian education, Christian ed, the guide to foundations of ministry. This practical application to coming down to Christian. I started out with a Christian perspective, expanded out to the world, and now come to the guide to foundations of ministry. Educational foundation, educational theory, educational administration, ministry specialization, and so on and so forth. This will include systematized understanding of Christian educational ministries. So this will be important in the guide to the foundations. This is where textbook will come in handy. Our this Christian education guide, this will help our understanding of educational foundation, educational theory, educational admin, educational ministries, educational specialization, and then in our 9th week, I'm gonna cover the practical application of religious education. I'm gonna apply this practically after minister handbook to the ministry. I'm going to cover the practical application of religious education. Practical application of religious education, we can see what we have learned so far and apply that to religious education. Remember what I told you about applying practically. I want this course to be a course where we can take things, apply it practically in our religious context. Without practical application, this course would be somewhat meaningless to you. I hope that I can really connect this in the last section, and then I want to end with conclusion, review, and concluding remarks. That is what religious education will be like, my time. What are we expecting in this course? What are we expecting in this course? What are our expectations? Is it some of the same thing over again? Is it some things that I can just get online? I want to really, really challenge you that I know religious education could be something that you haven't really thought about, but I want this thing to be something that you can have under your belt and say, okay, I received this instruction, I received this course, and now I can go and tackle anything that comes in my way, because it helps me to form my faith. The oldest monotheistic faith, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, they have a huge influence in our lives. So the countries that I shared to you in the East and the West, they were either touched by Christianity, Islam, or Judaism. They all know that. They have all been touched by it. Because if in the East, especially in the Middle East, Islam dominated looking at the Western world arena, Christianity was by far the main religion, and then Islam was the Middle East main religion, and Judaism was, spread throughout the corners of the world. They were showing this diaspora that's already covering world's majority of religion, right? And then when we come to the East, we have Buddhism, Hinduism. I didn't include Buddhism and Hinduism and Eastern religious influences, although I might briefly cover them, because they're not monotheistic. Especially Hinduism, I could have included that, but they're not monotheistic. Pantheistic education, I could have covered that with Greco-Roman religion and their pantheon. I didn't include that because I feel like that would be too complicated. That kind of religious education discusses many gods. So I wanted to just focus on monotheistic faiths and their religious education. So if you want to learn more about different kinds of faiths that have more than one God, especially I don't want to say Buddhism is I don't want to say Buddhism pantheism. I don't want to say Buddhism monotheism either, because in Buddhism you don't serve just one Buddha. You serve in that you can all be Buddha. You can all achieve a sense of nirvana or enlightenment. You can all be like me, Buddha. That's basically what Buddhism teaches you. And there's there's so much Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, Shinto Buddhism, a lot of Buddhism out there that I don't even know. And Hinduism, there's countless gods for everything. So I didn't want us to confuse ourselves in those kinds of religious educations. I wanted us to focus on what was very clear-cut, what we understand. Because we live in such a Judeo-Christian culture, sometimes we don't understand it, how important it is, but it's very important to see that we get our education in these monotheistic concept and paradigm. That's what I have. That's what I have with us. Again, we will Jewish education, Islamic education, Christian education, really monotheistic faiths. Religious education, again, Christocentric. That's what we want. That's what we want to come to. That's our main thing. Look at what Christ teaches us. Religious education, East and the West. Foundations of ministry, very important. Ministry, coming back to ministry. Practical application of religious education. And then I'm going to, what's going to happen is I'm going to conclude with this practical application. So that is what I have for you today. I hope this has been helpful and this is what we're going to do. So this gives you an outline of what we're going to focus on. Please have those required readings done. Having them done before would be amazing. If you just read them in advance, they're not long reads. If you do that, that will really help you understand more where I'm coming from, what I want to do with this course. Recommended readings, they're recommended, but they will be really helpful for you in understanding those things. That's what I have for you. And next week we're gonna kick it off with Jewish education. That will